Welcome to Iraq Matters, podcasting from the Old Railway Depot in Swamp Poodle, Washington, D.C.
I just love that intro.
What's Swamp Poodle?
It's actually right here where the office is located. Since the 1950s, this whole area of Washington, D.C. was known as Swamp Poodle because of its numerous swamps and puddles. It's also where Irish immigrants escaping the Irish potato famine took refuge.
Well, that seems to tie in really well with today's episode.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, many of our listeners are hearing the reports in the news. You know, there's a lot of turmoil and violence right now. A lot of Iraqis have been forced to flee their homes, and so they are now refugees or displaced within Iraq. And today we'll be talking with Nawaf, who is Yazidi from Sinjar, one of the cities that have been affected by recent violence, and also our dear colleague Christine Van Toorn.
And just for those of you that are wondering, you've tuned in to Iraq Matters, a podcast of news, ideas, and conversations about Iraq. Let's go back.
That's right. I'm Eric, and I'm pleased to be joined by our new intern. What's your name again?
My name is Sarah, remember?
You can tell she's new because she's still learning how to say Iraq.
You grow up in this country learning to say Iraq, and then I come here and everything's different. So I apologize if I slip up on that again.
No worries. So, Sarah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I just moved out here from Colorado, so I'm new to the city. I'm getting my master's in international affairs and conflict resolution at the George Washington University Elliott School.
Cool.
And I'm the new intern here at EPIC, and I'm really excited to be featured in this podcast.
And you can boost our listenership out there in Colorado. So
hopefully,
get your family
Colorado
and friends
fans, tune in.
So, let's kick off today's episode with Taif and Joe Wing for a quick Iraq update.
Hi, Joel. Thank you for joining us on Iraq Matters. How are you?
Fine, doing good. How are you?
I'm very good. So let's jump into it. Can you tell us about the latest security developments in Iraq?
Yeah, so in August there was a decline in the number of attacks. I think the fighting is still intense in some parts of the country, but I think there's no more big advances by the insurgents, so it's sort of stabilized. So the number of attacks have gone down. The casualties in the country, though, are still really high. In August, I counted the second most casualties of the year. So there's a lot of massacres going on by the Islamic State in the areas they control. So there's a lot of civilian casualties. There's a lot of casualties in the security forces that don't often get reported. So there's still a lot of violence going on. It just sort of leveled off from what it was a little bit before when the summer offensive started earlier back in June.
Right. And what are the updates with ISIS?
Well, they've actually suffered their first couple setbacks. They were trying to take a couple big targets, so they tried to take the Baji refinery in Saladin, and that failed. And they tried to make some advances. They've been attacking a big town in Anbar Haditha for over a month now, and they haven't been able to take that. And the security forces just had a couple joint operations with the United States Air Force helping out. And so they retook some towns in Nineveh. They retook some places in Saladin, Emirali, which is this town that had been holding out for weeks and weeks and weeks all by itself. A Turkmen town in Saladin had been holding out. And the security forces, well, it was mostly the militias actually, backed up by the United States Air Force, were finally able to break that siege. So they've actually had some setbacks in a couple parts of the country.
Okay, so that's good news. So, Iraq is currently going through a government formation process with a new Prime Minister, Haider al-Abdi. What can you tell us about al-Abdi and what are his top priorities?
Well, he's been saying a lot of good things, but we need to see what happens when he actually forms the government. So some important thing he's talked about is trying to shrink down the size of the government. The government for the last several years have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Every party that wins a seat in parliament basically gets control of a ministry, and there's so many parties and so many people want different positions. They've just been adding all these new ministries and new government positions. The government's just gotten huge. So he's talked about trying to cut down all these unnecessary ministry and positions. which is really necessary because the government's just gigantic and a lot of these people don't do anything. It's just used for patronage. So he's talking about that. That's a good thing. He gave a speech. Part of it, he talked about how all these militias that the government's come to rely upon, they need to be under state control. That's another good thing he's talked about. He made some comments about corruption as well. So he's talking about things that are important, but you have to look back at other governments. When Maliki first came into office, he talked about the same kinds of things, fighting corruption. The guy before him, Jafari, did the same thing. He talked about the militias need to be brought under control. So just because he's talking about it doesn't mean he's actually going to do it, but at least he's mentioning it. But we have to wait till his government is actually formed and see whether he can fall through on any of these things or not.
And the ongoing crisis in Iraq has paralyzed the country, which was already tormented with the 2003 invasion and the consequent civil war. What are the major challenges facing Haider al-Abdi?
Well, I mean, obviously, part of the country, the country's de facto divided now. You know, you've got a whole swath in the middle of the country controlled by the insurgents. So he has to reform the security forces, I think should be his top priority. Maliki put in a whole bunch of commanders who are basically loyal to him in order to coup-proof his government to make sure the military didn't rise up against them. And a lot of these people, I think, are incompetent, and they should have never been in a leadership position. So he needs to clear out a lot of the commanders, retrain them. It's a really long-term process he has to go through to try to get this cleared up. So I think that's his top priority, is getting the military reformed. And then after that, he has a whole bunch of other things. I mean, development in the country has really come to a standstill. Even before this, they never passed a budget this year, for example. Maliki was using the budget against his political opposition. And even before this insurgency offensive started, a lot of the provinces were running out of money. All these people, there were protests right before the summer. All these services had stopped. They couldn't pay the public employees, so they have to pass a budget and get the government working again. I think they have to restore confidence in the economy. I don't think a lot of foreign investors want to go to Iraq right now. It's just too dangerous. So I think that's stopped. But he first needs to work on security, get that reform. He has to get a budget passed. He's got to get confidence back in the country. So, there's like southern Iraq and Kurdistan. A lot of it is basically untouched by the insurgency. And I think he needs to talk to the world about that so he can get people to come back into the country and invest there to get the economy rolling, because I think that's really come to a standstill. So even people who aren't directly involved in the fighting are suffering because of what's going on.
Thanks, Joel, for the great updates, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Okay, thank you.
So let's talk about today's episode, but first let's kind of frame it with an update on the humanitarian situation.
Absolutely. The UN has estimated that more than 1.6 million Iraqis have been displaced, and that's in over 1,500 different locations.
Yeah, and this is just for this year alone. And also over 1,600 Iraqis have been killed, and more than 2,000 have been injured. So we're really starting to see a scale of violence that we haven't seen since the worst years of the Civil War.
And because of this, the UN has raised their crisis level designation for Iraq to a level 3 emergency, which is actually the highest designation they can give to any crisis going on in the world. Hopefully, the intention is to create a more effective aid response from the international community and increase awareness, but the effect of that has yet to be seen.
The UN made a strategic response plan for Iraq. They issued this in June, and the amount that they were calling for was $312 million to aid 1 million displaced Iraqis. Since then, you've had Sinjar, 300,000 people forced from their homes. You've had Karakush, over 100,000 people forced from their homes. That's a predominantly Christian area. You've had hundreds of thousands of others who have been forced to flee. So the real question is, what is the amount that's needed now based on those new numbers?
We also received a response to the letter written by EPIC and signed on by 35 other national NGOs and faith institutions. This letter was sent to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, calling for a stronger humanitarian response to the crisis in Iraq. And we received a response from him to this letter, and you can find it on our Facebook page if you're interested in reading it and seeing what he has to say.
Ultimately, the U.S., I think, and the international community needs to really step up and develop a long-term strategy for peace in Iraq and humanitarian action.
And I think one of our guests, Christine, really addresses that in the interview.
That's right. So let's talk about it. I had a chance to talk with Christine Toorn and Nawaf, and we actually did it through Skype. So we were interviewing them they were in Dohuk, which is not too far from Sinjar. Nawaf and his family are currently living in unfinished buildings. So you can just imagine cinder block room, and they have some Wi-Fi set up, and they got on Skype and we talked with them. So I'm really excited to introduce our listeners to this interview. I think it's an opportunity to really learn from someone who is Yazidi from Sinjar, directly from him, an account of what has happened and what is happening to his community now that hundreds of thousands have had to leave their historic homeland.
And in this interview, you guys use the term Daesh a lot. Could you maybe explain that a little bit more for those of us who aren't familiar with Arabic?
Sure. Daesh is the Arabic equivalent to the acronym ISIS, which is Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So when you hear Daesh, it's the same as ISIS.
That's good to know. So let's move forward and listen into this awesome interview that you did.
All right. Hello, dear listeners. This is Eric Gustafson with Iraq Matters. I'm very pleased to be joined on the line via Skype from Iraq. We have two guests with us. One guest who's been on our program before, Christine Toorn. Many of you will recall our previous podcast interviews with her talking about Bashika, talking about Sinjar and Nineveh and the countryside and recent events. She is also joined with a dear friend of ours, Nawaf, who is a student at American University of Iraq, Suleimani. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm a senior, yeah. This will be my last year.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. And Nawaf is from the city of Sinjar, one of the cities that have been impacted by the crisis, by the recent developments. So before we begin, Nawaf and Christine, you're somewhere in Iraq. Tell us where you are right now.
Right now we are in the Dohuk province, in one of the village, which is like about 30 minutes away from Dohuk, like to the northwest of Dohuk. It's a pure Yazidi village.
And Dohuk is not that far from the city of Mosul, which has fallen to ISIS. Is that correct?
No, Dohuk is about 60 kilometers far away from Mosul. Right now I'm with my family in Actually, we are three families here. My brother family and my uncle family in an unfinished building. Imagine it's like block and some cement, just the ceiling on the walls. It will be a building, but now it's unfinished.
Just to let you know, this town, Sharia, it had a population of about 10,000, and now there are about 30,000 from Sinjar staying here. And there are a lot of half-built homes like the one Nawaf's family is in, and everyone has families in it.
Wow, so it's really just basically an entire city in exile.
Yeah, and besides that, for example, this village has 5 schools. These schools also full of displaced people. You will find 4 families living in each classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They're building a camp here. You can see where they're clearing a field. But they're not tents up. They're still clearing it. So that will be, 2,000-3,000 families will be able to live there, but not for. I'm not sure how long it takes a camp to be built. Maybe a couple weeks.
I think for many of our listeners, they've heard the stories of the fall of Mosul, and more recently the seizure of Sinjar and surrounding villages by ISIS, by Daesh. And then you have had this mass exodus and people also trapped on the mountaintop of Mount Sinjar. So many people fleeing other areas. Briefly, for the two of you who are there on the ground, can you give our listeners a summary of the crisis? How many people have been forced to flee their homes? Where have they fled? And how many people are still trapped in the areas that are under the control of ISIS?
Like from Sinjar, only from Sinjar, about 305,000 people have fled to Kurdistan. But like Shia, for example, from Tel Afar, I would say more than 10 or 20,000 ended up in Najaf, where the majority of Shias living, like Najaf in the south side of Iraq. Some Sunni, I would say also thousands of Sunni families who would not be able to live under the ISIS control. Mm-hmm. Some of them ended up in Kurdistan. So basically, the Kurdistan is become, the spot where everybody is fleeing to.
Yeah, and then, on the east side of Mosul, you had probably about 100,000 flee from Bashika, mostly Yazidis, but also Shebek, Christians, and then Karakosh, another 100-some thousand, and then all the surrounding villages and areas east, northeast of Mosul, mostly Yazidi and Christian areas, you have that. So, even just like in the matter of a week, when August 3rd happened, when Sinjar happened, you had 300,000. Then August 6th to 7th, you probably had 300,000 more from east, northeast Mosul. So that's even just a microcosm of 600,000 in a week.
And in the case of Sinjar, which is historically a Yazidi village, and then Karakosh, which is historically a Christian village, these are villages that are now ghost towns. Is that correct?
They are really, yeah. They are. For example, in what I know about Sinjar, you would get all these empty villages where it's like, dark, no electricity, no anyone. From the people who still in the mountain, they describe to me, sometimes you will hear the sound of bullets or the guns, some fighting between maybe the ISIS or like YPG, the
Syrian PKK. Yeah, and that's how people describe Bashika too. Just everyone left, and Karakosh, everyone just left, and now you have Daesh there. You might have a few remaining Muslim families, but yeah, everyone left. So.
And you're mentioning that people on the mountainside will hear these engagement between the Daesh fighters, the ISIS fighters, and then these Kurdish militias that are militias that are coming in from Syria.
Yeah, they are the same militias that you may have heard about them when at the beginning when they open a road and save like thousands of family, they get them down from the mountain. They took them open the road for them till the Syria, then they came to Kurdistan from the Syria side.
And tell, just for our listeners, who are the PKK?
The PKK is a group that started in the 80s under Abdullah Öcalan to fight for Kurdish rights and even independence from Turkey.
Tell us the story of Sinjar and the surrounding area. Prior to the arrival of Daesh, who lived there? What's the context?
Yeah, since 2003, Sinjar was controlled basically by KRG government, and from KRG government, I would say the KRG parties, not for example, I would say the government from in Sinjar, where I would say either 90% of the Sinjar, the office, the institutions in Sinjar, they were controlled by KDP.
And the KDP is one of the most powerful political parties in the Kurdistan region.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So that's what, since 2003. And, there was, Asaish, we called it, the Asaish, the police, and even there were Peshmerga. When the U.S. troops were there, you have the combined control. Sometimes you will have U.S. soldiers, you have Iraqi army, and the Peshmerga and police. You will find them on the same checkpoints or in the same institution working together. But after that, there was kind of mostly were controlled by KDP or by the KRG.
Okay.
Sinjar is a district, and the large majority is Yazidi, 95% Yazidi, and then there are some Sunni Arabs, some Sunni Kurds in
there
villages.
Was some Shia also, I would say 1% of Sinjar were Shia. Even they had one of their shrines there, they call it Siti Zainab. was eventually it was blown up by Daesh or by ISIS.
And also, can you describe the countryside? I mean, what's the economy of this area?
They were mostly dependent on agriculture, some trading. I mean, not that big kind of trading, because like Sinjar was kind of in an area where it's 100 kilometers away from Mosul and 150 kilometers away from Dohuk. So it was just like cut from all of the parts. But the people there were mostly farmers. And this, you have this area we call the Rabia, which is located between Sinjar and Dohuk. So where they have this water dam. So people will go there from Sinjar, people will go there, they will make their agriculture with the Sunni Muslim there. And that's the way how they would live. After 2007, most of the many people joined army, many people joined Peshmerga.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, what you see today is kind of a mix between agriculture and kind of a patronage system.
Okay. But with the disruption and the violence, I mean, now you have fields that are going uncultivated, and how is that affecting, food prices in cities like Dohuk, not too far away?
The Sinjar was somehow, even before, was disconnected from Dohuk.
Okay.
I mean, Sinjar wouldn't have that influence in Dohuk, like the influence that Dohuk have in Sinjar, because till 2000, I would say 2005, Sinjar was depending mostly on Mosul from all everything. Like they were connected. But after that, Sinjar people basically depend on Dohuk and Zakho for their bring stuff, materials, food. But not the vice versa, not like Dohuk would depend on Sinjar.
The reason that switch happened is because, Sinjar was really part of Mosul's economy, but when Al-Qaeda came in and when violence got really bad, especially for Yazidis and religious minorities, in 2005, a lot of Yazidis didn't feel safe going to Mosul anymore. And there was this shift toward 2005, 6, 7, and especially 2007 with the biggest, the most fatal bombing of all of the years of the U.S. occupation here was in Qahtaniya, which also Tel Azar.
Yeah, also Tel Azar in Kurdish. Yeah, it's in the south side of the mountain where 500 people were killed and injured.
Yeah, and that was one of the single worst terrorist attacks in the entire conflict in terms of loss of life. So the crisis on Mount Sinjar, when you had tens of thousands fleeing Sinjar and then trapped on the mountainside before the corridors, the humanitarian corridors were opened up by the YPG, were able to open up the corridors and people were able to escape. That has brought, I think, world attention to the Yazidi people. Nawaf, as a member of the Yazidi community, what can you tell us about your community's origins, cultural life, and religious beliefs?
So Yazidi, like us, is a monotheistic a religion. They believe they believe also in the one God. They also the other religion. They have their own shrine, or when they practice their religious activity. For example, Lalish is a good example of the Yazidi religious shrines, and it's the biggest one. It's their Hajj.
Just for our listeners, where is it located?
In Dohuk, but also we have many of the shrines, many shrines located in the Sinjar's mountain. And I think 3 days ago, Daesh exploded one of them on the south side of the mountain.
Oh wow! And in terms of origins, historical origins, how far back does your community date itself in terms of its origins?
If you ask it the Yazidi scholars, they will refer to you more than 7,000 or 8,000 years. They will talk about the history of Yazidi.
Wow. And in the context of Iraq, what are the numbers in terms of Iraqis who are Yazidi?
600,000 maybe?
Yeah, 600,000.
Because you've got 300,000 in Sinjar.
Yeah, almost 300,000 in the area of Bashikhan, Bazani, and Shekhan.
Wow. And so over 600,000 Yazidi live in Iraq, and then there's also quite an extensive diaspora. Is that correct?
I mean, there are Yazidis in Armenia. There are Yazidis in
Georgia,
California.
There is a big community of Yazidi up in there in Germany also.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask a question that I know there's competing answers for, but ethnically, how do Yazidi see themselves ethnically?
I love this question. No, you have to do it. You're Yazidi.
Yeah, I mean, most of the Yazidi would see themselves as a third-rate citizen. Okay. Yeah, I mean, they will see themselves marginalized or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like also for, a Western audience, like, one of the things is that I've found, and Nawaf can either confirm or deny this, is that you really hear different things from different Yazidis. Some people will say, I'm Kurdish, and some people will say, man, I'm kind of Kurdish, and some people say, I'm not Kurdish. I mean, that's a minority. And I think that Yazidis are Yazidis first, whereas like if you meet a Kurd in Rania or Suleimania, they say, I'm Kurdish first. So I think they're just like Yazidis consider their Kurdish identity in different ways. And that is, I'd say also, is reflected in the KRG and how Kurds perceive of Yazidis. Like Kurdish Kurds say that Yazidis, sometimes they'll say Yazidis are Kurds. But in terms of, political and social treatment, that kind of challenges that narrative, I'd say.
Also, the thing is about Yazidi. Most of the Yazidi will find themselves, as Christine said, they will say, we are Yazidi first, then we are Kurd. And the thing is, like, under the Saddam, they would say, we are Yazidi first, then we are Arab. But they have changed. I think, so awesome. I mean, that's somehow interesting about Yazidi. So, I mean, not just Yazidi, all the minority, when they see the political or the things in the country is changing, they trying to create their own ethnicity. Like they would say we are Kurd, so they to feel like for the sake of survival or like, they would see the Kurdish, I mean, could be KRG that protected them.
That's where the political winds are blowing, so we better get with it.
If you ask some Yazidi in Armenia, he will never say I'm a Kurd.
Yeah.
Like, you will say I'm definitely a Yazidi. Even they came out with their own language, would say we are Yazdish. They don't say we are speaking Kurdish also.
So both of you have been taking quite a bit of time to collect testimonies, to collect the stories of people who have fled Sinjar, fled other areas. Can you share some of the stories that you've collected?
I mean, basically, we say like in the 3rd of August. So when Daesh were in fighting with the local people on the south side from like 2 a.m. till the morning. So, and in the morning when Peshmerga basically ran away, and like they said we had a strategy to, like, I don't know, to withdraw and then come back, but they basically, most of the people, they say the Peshmerga ran away and left us in the hand of ISIS. So many people have been killed. Here we are talking about thousands. I mean, they've been killed, captured, or just slaughtered. I mean, the pictures we saw that come to us from our mountain, not just from like random people, from my relatives. Like for my tribe, so I'm from Khanasor, the village. For my own tribe, like 5 blocks away, 63 people have been captured by the ISIS. So this is the overall situation. I mean, whole families being captured by ISIS or being killed. Wow. For example, other day I met a guy. He's the only guy left from, I think, 16 individuals of his family. So that's the story. We have met. I mean, my family. They made it. They didn't go to the mountain and stuck in the mountain. They made it at the first day to Duhok. But my uncle's family, they spent like 4 days in the mountain, and they were talking about this. I mean, these disasters or these like tragedies and sad stories about people like dying from thirst, from hunger, and from heat, like many children's, elders. Like these women, one of my friends telling like these women went to bring some water for her, two of her kids. When she came back, she found they are passed away. So she carried them out and went to the cliff, and with the two dead children, she like threw up herself from the cliff.
Oh my God! Wow.
I just like every single person you meet here has family members missing, knows of family members that were, massacred by Daesh, and has female family members and sometimes male family members that they know are being held by by ISIS in one of these locations that, we've all heard about, where, anywhere from 700, 800, 900, 1,000 Yazidi girls, women, men, families, boys are being held.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, one of my close friends, 5 of her sister right now in hands of Daesh. She hasn't been in contact since the first day.
Yeah, and I just also about this girl that Nawaf is friends with. We went and spoke with her family the other day, the remaining members, her parents and her brother, and they're living in a dirt field under a sheet held up by sticks on cardboard boxes. And, 5 of her sisters are being held by Daesh or by ISIS, and they have no access, and no home and no camp.
I mean, let's go back to the mountainside. I mean, the account of this woman who's went to get water for her children. We heard the story of airdrops of water and supplies. Can you give us some details? I mean, is it that it was a very long distance that she had to go to be able to fetch the water, and so the exposure in the sun resulted in these children dying?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about Sinjar mountain, it's not really a mountain that with a lot of trees and water. It's basically like a rock stuck in the desert.
And it's a mountain range. It's like 30 kilometers long,
Yeah. So you have in the base, like down of the mountain, not in the top of the mountain, you have some people have made farms there when they have water. So people wouldn't stay in that places because that will be the Daesh would have access to those places because they were close to the street or to the main road.
Yeah.
But then people will be on the top of the mountain, and some people will sneak away to get some water for their kids. Okay. That's how they get access to the water.
Oh,
I mean,
see. So they were basically sneaking down back to these farms to fetch water and then going back up into the mountains where their children were.
Yeah, I myself, I was like going crazy because what the media say. So I was watching TV and they say media, they're saying this aircraft or like helicopter is like dropping thousands of bottles of water. And then I'm on the phone, like people are dying from thirst. I said, where's this going on? I mean, they were doing something. I wouldn't deny that their help or their aid, but the way they were doing it's crazy. So they will like drop a ton of bottles of water from like maybe 500 meters. When these bottles hit the ground, like it's fled away, it's wasted.
Yeah, because a lot of them just smash open.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important to note that woman's story about, her children dying and then committing suicide is probably happened a lot. I mean, not maybe that specific story, but of women committing suicide, of children starving and, dying from dehydration. The stories are common. And these are things that happened on the mountain. People were up there for a week, 10 days.
Yeah, and I can just imagine, I mean, you lose everything and then you lose your child, like what's left?
Yeah.
It's...
Yeah.
So on Wednesday, The Guardian, which is a UK paper, reported the U.S. has said little about Mount Sinjar since 14 August, when President Obama declared the siege broken. But recent satellite imagery and interviews with Yazidis still on the mountain indicate a humanitarian emergency continuing to unfold. The report goes on to quote sources that estimate as many as 500 families still remain trapped on the mountaintop. What are you all hearing in terms of, for Nawaf, your contacts, Christine, and talking with the families? What are you hearing? Are there still people trapped on the mountaintop?
I don't. It's confirmed. Still there is 8,000 people in the mountain.
Oh wow.
Some of them are trapped. Some of them they are there just to stay there because we should not forget. Even before that, there was I would say 1,000 of people, 2,000 of people were living actually in the mountain where they take care of their sheep, their farms, something like that.
Yeah, and also, I mean, some of those people, I mean, I'm sure satellite imagery can differentiate between them, but there are also, and of course, we don't know exactly, but maybe a couple thousand of the new kind of the resistant brigades of Sinjar, which is young men and women from Sinjar have been trained by the YPG, the Syrian PKK, to go fight in the mountain. You also have Qasem Shesho, who is from Sinjar, who's kind of become the hero of Sinjar. He's been fighting on the mountain since day one. He never left. He has a group with him and then kind of scattered other fighters.
Qasem Shesho is the one who stayed there fighting from the first day. Then he's joined by the other guy also, is famous Khairi Shingali. Shingal is the Kurdish name of Sinjar.
Sinjar. Okay, interesting. So you do have a resistance that's continuing to put up a fight against Daesh.
Yeah, I mean the thing they are doing. So, for example, they have it's a resistant group, so they don't have this kind of weapons to just being in open battle with Daesh. They cannot do that. What they are doing, they are sneaking away, making their ambushes for Daesh or ISIS groups. Sometimes they are winning, some other times they are losing.
More like guerrilla warfare, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, I think they would really need. I mean, the idea now is that they would have to have support, weapons, equipment, and also other troops, support if they even wanted to seriously challenge Daesh control, ISIS control of all of Sinjar.
Now, earlier you were mentioning what happened in those early hours of the 3rd of August. And the Peshmerga, many report that the Peshmerga basically abandoned their posts. They fled. Now the Peshmerga, or I imagine the commander, is arguing that he was falling back to regroup to attack again, and then something happened. But what, from the evidence that you all have collected through these testimonies, I mean, what happened? Why weren't the residents alerted and evacuated in an organized way prior to Daesh arriving?
I think that it's very clear, and I would take issue with anyone that really disputed this narrative at this point. I mean, we have talked to a lot of people. It's not just, Nawaf and I that have talked to people. There's also, just from the evidence of what happened in Sinjar, sometime after 2 a.m., 8 to 10,000 Peshmerga troops withdrew from Sinjar without telling anyone and without helping locals evacuate. There definitely are exceptions to that. Some people have said, some Peshmerga stayed in this village, in this town, and here and there. But, in general, what we saw was a widespread withdrawal and abandonment of the local Yazidi population. And that withdrawal was detrimental because, you really hear different stories. I mean, we talked to the guys that were fighting in southern villages that thought Peshmerga were coming to back them up, and that's why they fought. I mean, you have people saying, well, we stayed in our house because we thought the Peshmerga were going to fight. People on the north side of the mountain were hearing about the Daesh ISIS attack from sisters and aunts and uncles, not in any sort of organized fashion. So this will have to be, hopefully investigated. And I think, what you're going to hear, and then what you have heard from the KRG, is that they were not expecting this attack. They were unprepared. They did not have sufficient equipment and sufficient forces. But, that then begs the question, well, why didn't you? Because for the past 2 months, the Sinjar has been surrounded on 3.5 sides by Daesh, and it's a Yazidi community. So, why weren't you prepared when basically the entire KDP-Sinjar relationship is based on the fact that the KDP and the KRG provide Yazidis in Sinjar with security, jobs, and in return, Yazidis in Sinjar have voted for them repeatedly. So there was a kind of total breakdown.
And is there been any public uproar or pressure on the government to be more transparent about how they're holding these commanders accountable?
I haven't seen he spoke he spoken publicly, but Ruda once put in their website or their media. Ruda is a Kurdish channel media that most of the population here they are watching or listening to.
Owned by the KDP.
Yes, owned by the KDP. Mm-hmm. He said, okay, we will try put those guys on investigation and we will put them on a fair trial for what they did to Sinjar.
Yeah.
So that statement was made, but there hasn't been any follow-up since then?
No.
A very common narrative here is that, the Iraq army or the Peshmerga are not equipped to fight Daesh, to fight ISIS in a certain location, and therefore they do a tactical withdrawal. They don't have enough ammo, they weren't, whatever the reason is. And I guess in some people's minds, and that is an acceptable, military strategy that you do a tactical withdrawal. But in this case, there were thousands of not only non-Muslims, but non-people of the book, which were easy and great targets for Daesh.
Yeah. Yeah, and they were there to serve and protect. They should have alerted the local community. With the hundreds of thousands who have fled and are now in these makeshift encampments scattered. You mentioned the one family that's just out in the field, with cardboard and a tent. Based on your research and connecting with these families and collecting testimonies, is humanitarian assistance, is it reaching these displaced and vulnerable Iraqis who have fled?
I would say not in the way that would satisfy. You have some aids going to the people, but we haven't seen that this kind of helping or aiding to people. For example, there is area is close to our village. It's called Khanke. These Khanke were 20,000 people, the population, but now they become 80,000 because 60,000 people came to the village, displaced people came to the village. And the situation those displaced people are living in, they living in disastrous situation. Their condition, for example, they've been there for more than 20 days with no bathroom. Some of the women and children, they haven't taken shower for more than 20 days. Yes, the day before yesterday I was there. We're trying to talk to some of the NGOs, to talk to some of these agency organizations to provide them at least with some bathrooms. That's the condition of some of them happen. I would say some of the families, they get help, but till now, the most of the help they get is from the local peoples, from local peoples of Duhok, of Zakho, the local peoples of these villages, Yazidi. For example, there is a camp they call Bajete camp. It was prepared, that camp was prepared for 4,000 people, but there is more than 20,000 people in that camp.
It's near Fish Khabar, the border crossing with Syria.
Okay, and so this is one of the transit camps?
Yeah, it was for Syrians, and then people from Tel Afar were there, and now people from Sinjar.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think, and, to Nawaf's point, and I don't mean this as an excuse. I think the UN and all the NGOs were overwhelmed by the hundreds and thousands of IDPs on top of, Syrians and people that had fled up here before the most recent crises in Nainawa. But there are a lot of cases that you just still have families living in dirt fields under a sheet with no bathrooms and no showers. And, that really needs to be addressed. I mean, I think one of the problems that the UN and aid organizations are having now is that everyone is dispersed, and it's really hard to reach such a wide spread group.
Still, up until this point, it sounds like aid agencies are still playing catch up to respond to the needs of hundreds of thousands of displaced Iraqis.
I was thinking of, like, even we were talking about, I thought there should be like a kind of emergency beside the aid. Because these people, they need urgent help. They need something. They are living in a kind of emergency.
Yeah, especially with healthcare too. That's a big problem. Every camp I've visited, people's main need is healthcare. I mean, other than bathrooms and these basics, is really with healthcare.
Just paint the picture for me. A family that has fled Sinjar and is now arrived there in Dohuk. You can even give me a specific example of a family. What have they endured to get there? How many days has it taken? What are the conditions that they're having to travel through?
This was probably a week ago, and they probably would have come off the mountain and walked for.
Yeah, I mean, for miles. Like I've heard, like some families would work for all the day till they get to the Syria border. From Sinjar Mountain to the Syria border is like more than 15 miles. Of course,
and once they get into Syria, I mean, they'd be reaching areas that are controlled by these local Syrian Kurdish militias, the YPG, and then they would provide transport to help them get to Dohuk.
Even there is like a camp there. It's called Nauruz camp. It's in Derka area. They call it Derke. Okay. So some of the I visited the camp like some days ago. They were talking about every day we would get 10,000 families. They would stay there and for 1 day, 2 days, like to take their rest, to relax, or to take shower. Then in the next days they will lead them way to Kurdistan. There is still like 2,000 families there in that camp.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, and this was, of course, what Nawaf is describing, the days that the YPG opened the safe route with the help of the American airstrikes. So we're talking August 14th.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you all are describing to me essentially is that not too long ago, Americans became very aware that, you had people trapped on the mountainside, Mount Sinjar, that it was an emergency. There were these airdrops and there was a sense of emergency. And then, but we don't feel, there's not that same sense of emergency, but yet, as I understand it, the United Nations has come out and declared a level 3 emergency for Iraq, which is the highest level emergency for the UN system. And that's what you're describing. I mean, can you give me a few other examples of the scale and urgency of the emergency?
I mean, basically most of their needs is they need shelter. For example, in this area, Khanke, some of the families, I would talk about hundreds of families. They will get only a tent. I mean, they have no mattress, they have no blanket. I've seen by like my own eyes that people are sleeping on the ground for 20 days with no mattress, with not even a piece of blanket.
Yeah, I mean, and that same situation that's going on in Khanki is out by Daraban, which is on the road from Dohuk to Fish Khabar, the border with Syria. We just saw hundreds of families living under tarps that they had attached to broken down tractors to provide shelter. I mean, kids playing in dirty water. I mean, there's not a store within a couple kilometers, and you just have families sitting on the ground underneath tarps. I mean, and that was last week. So, and they're still there.
And the other thing, like most of these families, they haven't brought anything with them. Even they didn't have like that time to collect their stuff, like their documents, like I would say ID, we call it jinsia, passport. Many of these families, they have left their money at home. They didn't have that time to get their money.
Yeah.
So I've met this guy. He's called Abu Abbas. He's living with other 4 families. They are more than 20 individuals living under this 2-meter square tent. I asked them why you don't try to move to the camp, because they are building a new camp near there. He said basically you couldn't find a tent yet. They put every 4 families in one tent, and the tent is, I think, 4 meters long, 2 meters wide.
When you go to the camps that are being set up, how would you evaluate the U.S. and international response so far to this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, and now, the UN's declared this a level 3 disaster. I mean, hopefully things will move more quickly. But I mean, you just have hundreds and thousands of people that fled their homes with very little in the course of a week and are scattered in 2 provinces. And most of them are living without shelter, without sufficient food, without access to bathrooms. So, yeah, I mean, this response we would have hoped had been, much quicker.
In terms of the Kurdistan regional government and also the government of Iraq, what has been the response so far that you're seeing?
Yeah, one of the responses, they were supposed to give each family 1 million Iraqi dinar, $1,000. But I would say third of the families, they haven't get that. One of them is...
Now, when you say $1,000, these are funds that are being dispersed by the Kurdistan regional government or by the government of Iraq?
By the Iraqi government.
Okay.
They give them to the people that displaced in Baghdad, in South.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there's been a lot of attention, of course, on the Yazidi, but we're just mentioning some of these other villages and towns that have been affected. I mean, in the areas that are under the control of ISIS, who else is being targeted?
I mean, would say Yazidi are in Sinjar, Yazidi are the first class, Shia, and Christian, Shabak. I mean, those are the minority. I mean, they were in Sinjar. Some of the Sunni also, for example, those people have been in army, in military. Those are also targeted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's anyone, religious minorities, but also those who resist Daesh. It doesn't matter your religion or your ethnicity if you don't, submit to their authority.
So, Christine, based on your research of the history of peaceful coexistence among the diverse communities of Nineveh, including the town of Bashika, how do you see these recent developments? Daesh was able to seize so much territory so quickly. In your view, what went wrong?
Well, I think, there are a variety of reasons that some, but not all, local Muslims or Arab Sunnis participated or collaborated with Daesh. I mean, I think in one sense, there were feelings of marginalization and loss of power among Muslim or Arab Sunni communities in Sinjar, for example, that might have led some to see Daesh, ISIS, as a way to regain power because of the rise of Kurdish, via the Yazidis' power in Nineveh. And I asked people here about why this happened, why some people collaborated. People say religion played a role. A lot of Sunni Arabs have stayed in their homes when Daesh comes through because they can. They want to protect their property. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And you can't make any judgment at this point about, I think, Muslim and Arab participation until you talk to people about why they stayed, what did they do when they stayed, how did they participate.
And it sounds like even more widely, I mean, that's been part of the analysis here, is that the policies of Prime Minister Maliki, who's now out of there, had kind of contributed to an environment that made it easier for ISIS or Daesh to find, at least, if not collaboration, at least complicity or accommodation for their rapid sweep across the countryside.
I honestly think that the Yazidis would have been more prepared, of course, had they not felt that they were being protected by a state army or regional army.
I'm going to ask you kind of a general question for both of you, very broad. Based on statements that you've heard from President Obama, Secretary Kerry, General Dempsey, and other public officials, do you believe that the Obama administration has a good handle on what's going on and a strategy for rolling back ISIS?
No, I mean, especially after Obama's statement last night that we don't have a strategy on ISIS. I think there's a total divide here. You know, everyone knows, and even the U.S. administration has said that Daesh presents one of the biggest threats the world has seen, but we limit airstrikes to, you know, the U.S. consulate in Erbil, and of course, very importantly, which is very important to protect U.S. citizens, but and also to rescue these 40,000 Yazidis that were on the mountain. But it's like what Al-Qaeda, when we talk about this, it's whack-a-mole. I mean, you hit them in Mahmour and near Erbil, and they pop up somewhere else. You hit them at Mosul Dam, and then more of them are going to go to Bashika and Karakosh. So I think that there needs to be a widespread campaign by the U.S., its allies around the world to combat this threat. And I don't think, you know, people say this is an Iraqi war, this is a Kurdish war. I don't think it is. I don't think that Al-Qaeda or Daesh, ISIS, was created just by Iraq or just by Syria. I mean, I think their policies of the governments, of course, in some way, shape, or form contributed to this. But to me, it's a big disconnect between what we're saying we're going to do policy-wise and what we have labeled this, which is a massive threat.
So it sounds like one of the characterizations that you would object to is oftentimes it's presented as their fight. I think that's a common speaking point of the Obama administration, is talking about, you know, supporting the Iraqis in their fight.
Well, it's also just not even an Iraqi fight. I mean, ISIS was, I mean, not born, but raised in Syria. So this is a Middle East problem, but it's also a global problem. You know, there's enough blame. I don't want to, say blame, but there are a variety of policies that have contributed to the rise of this terrorist organization. So I don't think it's right to say it's someone's fault, then it's your fight because it's your problem. I mean, that's just not, I don't see it that way.
And in terms of understanding ISIS, Daesh, there's been different analysis, but are we talking about a terrorist organization? Are we talking about a non-state paramilitary organization? Are we talking about a state-building enterprise? What are they?
Well, I mean, I think they're probably a little bit of both. I mean, they're clearly conquering a lot of territory, and then in the territories that they're conquering, they're attempting to put governing structures in place. I don't mean to legitimize what they're doing. I don't see it as legitimate, but you could make that argument. I mean, they're looking to conquer territory and then control that territory, not just through force, but, well, mostly through force, but also through governance. Trying to pay people salaries and things like to set up these, quote unquote Islamic courts. So they're clearly trying to govern and build economies in the places that they conquer.
And I think also it seems that given, ethnic and religious cleansing, remaking these places in a way that they weren't before at all, like just ignoring the history, destroying ancient cultural sites. Nawaf, in terms of the media coverage that you've been seeing, is there something that you feel like the international media coverage of the crisis is getting wrong?
I think media is helping Daesh a lot. Yeah, one of the weapon that Daesh is using is the media. They want to scare us, like just freak out people. Because, for example, when Sinjar fell down, all the Kurdistan was like in a shock. Even most of the people, they fill their car with fuel that night and they want to flee away.
Yeah, there's this documentary that Vice News put out, and there's these headlines of like when there's a beheading, and it seems like that really plays to the advantage of ISIS and their propaganda. It seems like it's an effort to portray that this terror so that villages or towns or armies will flee, and you don't even have to fight them anymore because your propaganda has done your work for you.
Well, I mean, I think that also, it's like with the Iraq army leaving Mosul, that set the stage for this idea that Daesh was undefeatable and, intimidating, which I think they are a strong fighting force. But when they have this media campaign and you see, various armies withdrawing and not fighting, that also feeds into it.
Now, here in the United States, school year is starting, and I'd imagine school is scheduled to begin there in the Kurdistan region in Iraq. What's happening in terms of, schools starting?
Well, I think schools will start and will open, but, you have to remember we've got about 1 million kids who won't be in school this year, or maybe will be in overcrowded schools that have been displaced from Sinjar, from areas around Mosul, Bashika, Karakosh, Diyala, Salahdin. So you're going to have a huge amount of, education interrupted, which continuously happens through Iraqi history. Also, this isn't in the KRG, but, in Salahdin province, in Nainawa, of course, in Mosul, in Anbar. I don't know, I'm not quite sure about Diyala yet. You have universities that are closed and schools that are closed, where we're not talking about IDP populations. You're going to possibly have a lot of children not going to school because of fear of Daesh and conflicts going on.
Well, and also you were describing earlier, some of these schools are crowded with families, displaced families. Will the camps be set up in time to get the families resettled in the camps for the kids to be able to go to those schools?
That's one of the things we hope to, and that's one of the things people are scared of. Some of the families in the school, they are trying to flee to Turkey or try to find a place before the school starts.
Okay.
I think that I'm sure that what they're aiming for right now is to have these camps open before the school year starts. Whether that's possible, I don't know. And I think even with that, you're going to have overcrowded schools, and you have a lot of kids not going to school. So the final question: what do Yazidi from Sinjar and Bashika want now, Nawaf?
I would talk about the majority of them. They want to flee to Europe or to safer places. This is one of the options, but most of them think, this could be impossible because we haven't seen this is mass of immigration by any population. And the other thing they want international protection,
like the UN peacekeepers.
Okay, to be able to establish a safe and protected zone for them to be able to return to Sinjar?
Yeah, for Yazidi, so they cannot be attacked based on their background or ethnicity or religion.
Yeah, and I think, the ideal situation for a lot of Yazidis, they don't want to go back to Sinjar. They don't trust their neighbors anymore. They don't trust Kurdish security forces. They don't trust Iraqi security forces. So that makes people, of course, want to emigrate to Europe, to Canada, to the US, to Australia. And, anyone that does want to go back, and this is also, by the way, true for Bashika, because there wasn't a lot of violence there, people don't have that memory, and they're more willing to go back. They always say we will never go back unless there is international protection. U.S. forces, UN forces and with that should come a region. A region for minorities, a Yazidi Christian region or a Yazidi region. But that would have to be part of the deal. And I think, from now on, local government is really going to have to be local. And the Yazidis from Sinjar will have to be more included in those structures.
That also seems to be a theme of, I've heard that from a few people, like Michael Knight's analysis about what the new prime minister of Iraq needs to do. One of the things he says needs to be a priority is decentralization, empowering local communities to govern themselves. So it seems to be a theme.
Yeah, particularly true for Sinjar, especially in terms of security forces. That would have to be, I think, a combination of an international force, whether that was UN peacekeepers, and then a local all Yazidi kind of Sinjari brigade.
Excellent. Well, thank you both of you for this. For your time and for this conversation. I think it's helping our listeners better understand the crisis on a deeper level.
Thank you for giving us the chance to give your listeners more overview about what happened in Sinjar.
Yeah, thank you.
On behalf of EPIC, thank you to Christine and Nawaf for joining us on Iraq Matters.
Now, we'd really like to hear from our listeners. Please visit us online, share comments and questions and any ideas you might have for future stories. We also would love it if you would follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on Iraq.
We also encourage you to subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher so that you can get newest episodes as soon as they're released, and share them. Be sure to share this episode with your friends and family. So this is Eric.
And this is Sarah.
Reminding you that
Iraq matters.